Hey, let's talk about table saws for a second. I consider it to be the center of my workshop, and if you're doing any serious carpentry, I just couldn't live without it. If I could only have one power tool, it would have to be the table saw. And I don't have a very exotic space to work in, so not only does my table saw cut things, but it's also a workbench for me, and it gets a lot of abuse. I don't worship it, I don't wipe it with a diaper or anything like that, but I try to take care of it and make sure it gives me good cuts. So let's just talk about that part of it for a second. Almost any of the table saws that you can get will probably work just fine for you. I've never had a pro table saw or a cabinet grade or anything like that, but this works fine for me. So most of the table saws that you get come with the fence, and they come with a sliding square like this. This you can get rid of. It's a very useless tool. It's not very big. I hardly ever use it, so I'm going to set it out of the way. I prefer a homemade sled, which supports the work much better, and maybe I'll talk about that on another video. To take care of the top of the table saw, basically I have a simple little metal scraper that I bought at one of the fancy pants woodworking store, and I can scrape old paint residue and things like that, bits of varnish, all sorts of stuff like that. It's very, very handy for a couple of bucks. And then if I'm doing a pretty sensitive project, I have a little bit of wax that I will just rub a little bit of wax on there to keep some of the scratching down. Okay? So what are the essentials of the table saw? Well, you want everything that you're referencing to be absolutely parallel to the blade. So when you get a table saw, first thing you do is don't use the blade that comes with it. They just put in any old kind of a blade when they sell you the table saw. So go to the hardware store, or even Home Depot. That's where I get these. I get these Diablos, and I think this is a 50 point. It does nice fine work. It's not the best for, endlessly ripping large pieces of lumber, but I get good all-around cuts with this blade. And then every once in a while, got to buy a new blade. So this blade needs to be absolutely parallel, not only with the fence, but with these two grooves that are machined into the cast iron top of your table. So you have to set all this up and make sure it's parallel. So the first thing I do is make sure that the blade is parallel with these grooves. And so I use my combination square, and I track the front and the top of the edge of the carbide tips on the blade. So let me set the camera up and see if we can get a close-up shot of that. Okay, so I set my combination square to slide against the edge of this groove and the end of the rule to just barely touch the edge of that carbide tip. And I'm going to slide it in both directions and make sure that the spacing here is exactly the same as the spacing here. And then we flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. We don't have to be accurate within a 10,000th of an inch or some engineering standard, but we should be pretty doggone close on both ends. If these slots are not parallel with the blade, then the saw has to be aligned in the arbor area, which is down underneath. And for a lot of people, if this simple test doesn't work when you buy a brand new table saw, and you don't want to really mess with the guts of the table saw, you might want to think about returning it to the store and getting another one and telling them that the tracks are not parallel with the blade. And I don't think that they should argue with you too much. All right, now you need to make sure that the blade for your standard cuts is 90 degrees to the top of the table. And here again, you can use a manufactured 90-degree gauge. And you don't want to check it against the tooth, you want to check it against the blade itself. And you want to run that gauge up, and you look at the crack of light on there. In this case, there's a teensy crack. So I would want to adjust the tilt of the blade until there's absolutely no light coming through between my 90 gauge and the blade. And get that set up when it's pretty high. Your error is going to multiply as the blade goes up. So if you can set that pretty exacting with the blade pretty high, then it should work just fine for you. I recommend that when you're messing with your table saw blade, that you always not just have the switch turned to off, but that your table saw is unplugged. It can't possibly turn on accidentally with it unplugged. So that's my safety feature. You'll notice that I don't have all the safety gizmos set up on my saw. You should probably use all that safety equipment. For me personally, I like to be able to see clearly the blade and know exactly where the blade is and where my fingers are. And I've been playing with table saws since I was about 8 years old, so I'm just used to them. But I do not take them for granted. I respect the table saw, and when that blade is spinning, there's absolutely nothing anywhere in the world that's more important than that blade and where your fingers are. So you want to respect that at all times. Okay, now let's talk about the fence. So now that we know that our grooves are absolutely parallel with the blade, now it's time to set up our fence. And the fence is always adjustable. Once you lock it in, it should be absolutely parallel and true with the blade, just like these grooves, and you can adjust the fence and get it set up that way. Most of the table saws will have a readout, little numbers, and it'll have a little plastic gauge with a red line or some colored line on there and adjustment screws. Table saws shake and rattle, they get bumped with lumber. You can't always trust this gauge. First of all, you have to set it up to a value that you can trust, and then you have to periodically check it because this little guy will move, and on a critical cut you don't want to make that error and have something that you cut be 1/4 of an inch too narrow simply because you forgot to check this gauge or you trusted the little plastic tape that was on the side of the machine. So let me show you how I do it, and we'll go from there. Alrighty, so I set my fence up for exactly 3 inches on the number bar on the ruler that's built into the saw. But I don't want to trust that because this is a pretty important cut. So I'm going to take my combination square and check the inside of the front tooth and the inside of the back tooth, and making sure that that space is 3 inches. The worst possible scenario is that this is narrower on this end than this end, and that will cause your work to pinch in the saw, and it will want to throw something back at you, and that's very bad. If there's a slight discrepancy, you want it slightly wider here than here so that the work goes free and doesn't jam and pinch. And then, as always with the saw, when you're pushing work through, you don't want to be pinching the work into the blade because that causes trouble. So I always manually check those 2 reference points if the cut is very important. If it's just a general cut, then I can, after checking, I can trust the numbers on the table saw, but I always double check for sure. Okay? Well, have some fun, take care of your fingers, and we'll see you later.